The cold metallic hum of the auction house's cargo bay was a sound Elias Kyle had grown to associate with opportunity. A battered stasis pod, streaked with centuries-old grime, sat in the center of the room, illuminated by flickering overhead lights. Around him, bidders murmured in a dozen alien tongues, their voices low and hungry. This pod was said to contain the treasure of a lost empire, and for the right price it would be his. Elias smirked, leaning against a support beam. The competition here were amateurs, pirates and wannabe treasure hunters, blinded by their greed. He, however, had the upper hand. A forged credit account, courtesy of an old friend, ensured he'd outbid anyone without breaking a sweat. Going once, going twice. The auctioneer, a spindly insectoid, chirped. Elias raised his hand, adding a casual, almost mocking flourish. The room fell silent. No one dared to counter his bid. Sold to the gentleman in Sector 7. The crowd parted as Elias strolled toward his prize, his boots echoing on the polished floor. The pod was larger up close, its surface covered in faint glyphs that pulsed faintly, as if the machine were alive. He traced a finger along its edge. "Well, old girl, let's see what you're hiding." Moments later, the pod was delivered. To his ship, the Wayfarer. It sat in the middle of his cargo bay, an enigmatic relic demanding attention. Elias paced around it, his heart pounding with anticipation. He activated a data pad, decoding the ancient locking mechanisms. The glyphs flared brighter, then dimmed. With a hiss of escaping gas, the pod cracked open. Inside, he expected gold, jewels, or even rare artifacts. Instead, a figure emerged. A woman lying in suspended animation. Her skin was a pale lavender, almost pink, with an iridescent sheen that caught the light. Her hair cascaded in silken waves, and her figure, though alien, was undeniably breathtaking. "What the?" Elias blinked, stepping back. The treasure of a lost empire was a person? Before he could process it, her eyes snapped open. They glowed faintly, burning with intelligence and defiance. In an instant she moved, faster than he could track, her hand closing around his throat. "Where am I?" she demanded, her voice sharp and commanding. Elias gasped, raising his hands in surrender. "Easy. You're on my ship. I just opened the pod." Her grip tightened. "Who sent you? Are you one of them?" "One of who? I don't even know who you are." His voice cracked, and he cursed himself for sounding so pitiful. She studied him, her glowing eyes narrowing. Then, as quickly as she had grabbed him, she released him, and he collapsed to the floor, coughing. "I don't trust you," she said flatly, stepping out of the pod. She moved with the grace of a predator, scanning the room with practiced precision. "But if you were working for them, I'd already be dead." Elias scrambled to his feet, glaring at her. "You're welcome, by the way. I just saved you from being someone else's prize." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Saved me or claimed me?" The accusation stung, but Elias wasn't about to back down. "Listen, lady, I didn't pay a small fortune to be strangled on my own ship. Maybe start with a thank you?" Her lips curled into something resembling a smirk, though it carried no warmth. "Thank you," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Elias sighed, running a hand through his hair. This was not how he imagined his day going. "All right, let's start over. I'm Captain Elias Kale, and you are?" She hesitated, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Lyra." "Lyra," he repeated. "Great. Now can you tell me why you were in that pod, and why people might want to kill me for opening it?" Lyra folded her arms, studying him. "You're asking the wrong questions, Captain. The real question is, how long do you think you can keep me safe?" Before he could respond, an alarm blared. The ship's AI chimed in, its monotone voice calm but urgent. "Hostile vessel approaching." Weapons locked. Elias cursed under his breath. "Looks like we're about to find out." He darted to the cockpit, Lyra close behind. The approaching ship was a sleek, predatory design, pirates, no doubt, drawn by rumors of the pod. Elias powered up the engines, his hands flying over the controls. Lyra watched him work, her earlier hostility replaced by a cold, calculating focus. If they board, they'll kill you and take me. Do you have weapons? Enough to make them regret it, Elias muttered, glancing at her. But if you've got any tricks up your sleeve, now's the time to share. Lyra didn't respond. Instead, she stepped to a console, her fingers dancing over the controls. The ship shuddered as the pirate vessel opened fire, but Elias managed to evade the worst of it, diving into a nearby asteroid field. The grin faded as the pirates followed them into the field, their cannons lighting up the darkness. Lyra stepped forward, her hand brushing against Elias's arm. "Let me help," she said, her voice softer this time. Elias hesitated, then nodded. "Don't make me regret this." Lyra's hands moved with inhuman precision, overriding systems Elias didn't even know his ship had. A pulse of energy erupted from the Wayfarer, disabling the pirate ship's weapons and engines. Elias stared at her, stunned. "What the hell was that?" Lyra met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "A glimpse of why they want me." Elias swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't just about treasure anymore. Whatever Lyra was, she was worth far more than he bargained for. And she might just be the most dangerous cargo he'd ever carried. The silence in the cockpit was deafening after the pirate ship drifted, powerless, into the asteroid field. Elias exhaled slowly, his grip on the controls relaxing for the first time since the chase began. He glanced sideways at Lyra, who leaned against the console with an unsettling calm. "So," Elias began, breaking the tension, "you're not just some girl in a pod. Care to explain what kind of walking disaster I've got on my hands?" Lyra tilted her head, studying him with a mix of amusement and caution. "You wanted treasure, Captain. Congratulations, you found it. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting for now." She crossed her arms and leaned back, her eyes darting to the viewport as if calculating the next threat. Elias rubbed his temples. "Great. I go to an auction, spend a fortune, and instead of retiring on a beach somewhere, I get a cryptic alien with trust issues and a target on her back." He shot her a sidelong glance. "Should be flattered or terrified?" "Terrified," she replied, her tone cool and even. The ship's AI interrupted, its voice slicing through their exchange. "Damage report. Minor hull breaches on decks 3 and 5. Recommend repairs before further engagements." "Thanks, genius," Elias muttered, already setting course for the nearest repair station. "And what about our friends out there?" "Hostile vessel remains non-functional. Probability of pursuit, minimal." "Small blessings," Elias said. He turned his attention back to Lyra. "You're lucky I'm not the type to cut my losses." Lyra raised an eyebrow. "Lucky? I'm not the one who bought something without knowing what it was." Her words stung more than Elias cared to admit. "All right, point taken. But if you want to survive, you're going to have to trust me just a little." She hesitated, her gaze softening ever so slightly. "Trust is a luxury I can't afford." Before Elias could respond, the ship's comm system crackled to life. "Unidentified vessel. This is Outpost Viridian. State your business." Elias keyed the comms. "Viridian, this is the Wayfarer. Requesting emergency docking for repairs." A pause, then a gravelly voice replied, "Docking authorized. Don't bring trouble." Elias smirked. "Trouble? Never heard of her." Lyra shot him a look, but he caught the faintest hint of a smile before she turned away. Docking at Viridian was straightforward enough. The outpost was a ramshackle cluster of modules bolted together in the middle of nowhere, a perfect haven for smugglers, mercenaries, and the desperate. Elias paid the docking fees and ordered the repairs, keeping one eye on Lyra the entire time. "Stay close," he warned, as they stepped onto the station's main concourse. "Worried I'll run?" she asked, her tone teasing. "Worried someone will recognize you and try to cash in on your unique value." Lyra didn't reply, but the subtle shift in her posture told Elias she understood the danger. The concourse was bustling with activity. Traders hawking dubious wares, bounty hunters scanning for marks, and mechanics shouting over the din of malfunctioning machinery. Elias moved through the chaos with practiced ease, but Lyra's presence drew more than a few curious glances. They reached a dimly lit cantina, where Elias flagged down a contact, a wiry man with cybernetic eyes named Bran. "You're late," Bran said, his voice low and gravelly. "Had a run-in with some overzealous pirates," Elias replied, sliding into a booth. "Need some info." Bran's gaze flicked to Lyra, lingering just long enough to make Elias bristle. "This about her." "Eyes on me, Bran," Elias said sharply. "What do you know about stasis pods from the old Empire?" Bran leaned back, tapping a finger against the table. "Depends on the pod. Some are worth more than starships. Others, let's just say they come with complications." Lyra's expression didn't falter, but Elias could feel the tension radiating from her. "Let's assume I've got one of the complicated ones," Elias said carefully. Bran's smile didn't reach his eyes. He trailed off, his gaze darting to Lyra again. Elias leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Who are we talking about? Pirates? Mercenaries?" Bran shook his head. "Worse. Syndicates, bounty hunters, and maybe even the remnants of the more Empire itself. Whatever you've got, it's a magnet for trouble." "Fantastic," Elias muttered. "Any advice?" "Yeah," Bran said, standing. "Don't stick around too long. This station's not as safe as it looks." With that, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving Elias and Lyra alone in the booth. "Well, that was helpful," Elias said, leaning back with a sigh. Lyra's eyes were fixed on the table, her hands clenched into fists. "We need to leave." "I got that much. Thanks." He hesitated, then added, "What's got you so spooked?" She looked up, her expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "If the Empire's remnants are involved, they won't stop. Not until I'm either in their hands or dead." Elias frowned, his earlier sarcasm melting away. "We'll figure it out. Together." Lyra's gaze softened, and for a moment, she looked as if she wanted to say something. But before she could, the cantina's door burst open, and a group of heavily armed mercenaries stormed in. Elias cursed under his breath. "Looks like Bran wasn't kidding about this place." Lyra's eyes met his, and a spark of determination replaced her fear. "Let's move." Together, they slipped into the shadows, the sound of heavy boots and shouted orders echoing behind them. As they darted through the cramped alleys of the outpost, Elias couldn't help but notice how effortlessly Lyra moved. Every twist and turn seemed second nature to her, as though she'd navigated chaos her entire life. "So," Elias hissed, as they ducked behind a stack of supply crates, "any chance you want to fill me in on why those guys are ready to tear this place apart for you?" Lyra peered around the corner, her keen eyes scanning for their pursuers. "You're asking a lot of questions for someone who just saved my life." "Yeah, because I'd like to keep doing that." He gave her a pointed look. "I'm a fan of staying alive. Call it a quirk." Her lips curved into a faint smirk, but it vanished as shouts echoed from the cantina. "They're spreading out. We need to find your ship fast." Elias shook his head. "Can't. Repairs aren't done. We'd barely make it out of the docking bay." "Then we make a stand." The sheer bluntness of her statement took Elias aback. He studied her for a beat, taking in the set of her jaw, the unflinching resolve in her gaze. "You're serious?" "Deadly." She glanced at the makeshift weapons she'd snagged earlier, a jagged piece of scrap metal and a compact blaster. "We can bottleneck them in one of these corridors, even the odds." Elias groaned. "I hate when my cargo talks back." But despite his protests, he found himself following her lead. They picked a narrow corridor with only one entrance, stacking crates and debris to create makeshift cover. Elias's heart pounded as footsteps grew louder, the mercenaries closing in. Lyra crouched beside him, her expression unreadable. "You don't have to fight, you know. You could walk away." Elias snorted. "And miss out on this bonding moment? No chance." A flicker of something, gratitude maybe, crossed her face. Then the first mercenary rounded the corner. Lyra moved first, her reflexes inhumanly fast. The blaster in her hand spat bright bolts of energy, dropping the lead mercenary before he could fire. Elias followed suit, his own shots keeping the others at bay. The firefight was chaotic, the confined space amplifying every blast and shout. Elias was painfully aware of how outnumbered they were, but Lyra's precision was uncanny. Every movement was calculated, every shot deliberate. "Who trained you?" he shouted over the din, reloading his weapon. "No one you'd want to meet," she called back, her voice tight with effort. Elias ducked as a barrage of fire tore through their cover, sending shards of metal flying. "Well, remind me to send them a thank you card." Lyra didn't respond. She was too focused on the fight, her movements almost fluid as she took down another mercenary. But Elias could see the strain in her posture, the way her breaths came quicker. Their makeshift defenses wouldn't hold much longer. As another explosion rocked the corridor, Elias grabbed Lyra's arm. "We need to move." She hesitated, her eyes darting to the advancing mercenaries. Then she nodded, and they bolted down the corridor, weaving through the maze-like outpost. By the time they reached a maintenance hatch, both of them were panting. Elias keyed the access panel, praying it still worked. Come on," he muttered as the panel blinked red. Lyra shoved him aside. "Let me." Her fingers flew across the controls, and the hatch hissed open. "Remind me why I'm the captain," Elias quipped as they slipped inside. "Because you're good at spending money on bad ideas," Lyra shot back, though her tone was lighter than before. They sealed the hatch behind them, the noise of the mercenaries fading as they descended into the outpost's lower levels. The air down here was colder, the corridors dimly lit and eerily silent. Elias leaned against the wall, catching his breath. "Well, that was fun. Let's never do it again." Lyra smirked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You handled yourself better than I expected. I'll take that as a compliment." He eyed her, his curiosity getting the better of him. "Seriously though, what's your story? You're not just some random girl in a pod." Lyra hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. For a moment, Elias thought she wouldn't answer. But then she spoke, her voice quieter than before. "I was engineered," she admitted. "Created to be useful, perfect, but they made me too well. I escaped before they could figure out how to control me." Elias stared at her, trying to process her words. "Engineered? Like, genetically?" She nodded. "And enhanced. Physically, mentally. I'm not human, Elias, I'm their weapon." The weight of her confession hung in the air between them. Elias didn't know what to say. Finally, he managed, "Well, for a weapon, you're surprisingly personable." Her laugh was soft, almost bitter. "Don't get used to it." But there was a hint of warmth in her voice, a crack in the armor she'd built around herself. And for the first time, Elias felt like he was starting to understand her, just a little. "We'll figure this out," he said firmly. "You're not alone in this." Lyra looked at him, and for a moment the walls she kept so carefully intact seemed to waver. Then she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. Their brief moment of quiet was shattered by a distant clang, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots. Elias sighed. "Looks like they found us." Lyra's eyes hardened. "Then let's make them regret it." Together they turned to face the coming storm, ready to fight side by side once more. The first mercenary burst into the corridor, his heavy boots echoing ominously against the metal walls. Lyra didn't hesitate. She vaulted over a railing, landing with a grace that defied gravity, her blaster firing before the mercenary even had a chance to react. Elias followed, though his approach was decidedly less elegant. He dove behind a stack of crates, narrowly dodging a volley of energy blasts. "Remind me to upgrade my blaster after this," he shouted, returning fire. Lyra ducked behind a support beam, her movements swift and precise. "You'd be better off upgrading your aim," she called back, the corner of her mouth twitching, in what Elias could swear was a smirk. The banter was cut short as more mercenaries poured into the corridor, their weapons lighting up the narrow space with bursts of red and blue. Lyra's expression darkened, and she gestured for Elias to move. They're trying to box us in. We need to get to higher ground. You don't say, Elias muttered, scrambling up a narrow ladder bolted to the wall. Lyra covered him, her blaster picking off the advancing enemies with unnerving accuracy. Reaching the upper platform, Elias pulled her up just as another explosion rattled the structure. This whole place is falling apart, he said, coughing through the smoke. Lyra glanced down at the chaos below, her eyes narrowing. We can use that. Use what? The crumbling death trap? She ignored him, scanning the area until her gaze landed on a row of exposed pipes running along the ceiling. Without a word, she aimed her blaster and fired. The resulting explosion sent a cascade of steam and debris into the corridor, scattering the mercenaries and cutting off their advance. Lyra turned to Elias, her expression calm but determined. That'll buy us some time. Let's move. They sprinted through the upper level, the outpost's dim emergency lighting casting long shadows across their path. Elias's mind raced as he tried to piece together a plan. We can't keep running forever. Do you have any bright ideas? Lyra glanced at him, her expression unreadable. Do you trust me? Elias hesitated. That depends. Are you about to do something insane? Her lips twitched into a faint smile. Probably. Before he could protest, Lyra grabbed his arm and veered toward a maintenance hatch. She keyed the access panel with practiced ease, and the hatch slid open to reveal a narrow ventilation shaft. You've got to be kidding me, Elias groaned. Do you want to live or not? Lyra countered, already climbing in. Muttering under his breath, Elias followed her into the shaft, the metal walls pressing uncomfortably close on all sides. The sound of pursuit grew fainter as they crawled deeper into the maze of conduits and pipes. After what felt like an eternity, Lyra stopped, her head tilting as if listening for something. This way, she said, taking a sharp turn. Elias sighed. Do you have some kind of internal GPS, or are you just making this up as you go? A little of both, she replied, her tone light despite the tension. They emerged into a dimly lit chamber filled with humming machinery. Lyra moved quickly, her hands flying over a console as she accessed the outpost systems. What are you doing? Elias asked, glancing nervously at the only entrance to the room. Locking down the lower levels and rerouting power, Lyra said, her focus unwavering. If they're going to chase us, they'll have to fight through a lot more than steam. Elias watched her work, a mixture of awe and frustration bubbling inside him. You're full of surprises, you know that? Lyra glanced at him, her expression softening for a brief moment. You're not so bad yourself, Captain. Before Elias could respond, the console beeped and Lyra stepped back. Done. Let's get to your ship. The journey back to the Eye, Wayfarer, was mercifully uneventful, the lockdown and rerouted power slowing their pursuers to a crawl. By the time they reached the docking bay, the ship's repairs were complete, and the engines hummed with readiness. Elias didn't waste any time. He ushered Lyra aboard and took the pilot's seat, his fingers dancing across the controls. Hold on. This might get bumpy. Lyra strapped herself into the co-pilot's chair, her gaze steady. I'll take bumpy over dead. The ship lifted off, the outpost's docking clamps releasing with a loud clunk. Elias guided the Wayfarer out of the bay and into open space, the stars stretching endlessly before them. As the adrenaline began to fade, Elias glanced at Lyra, who was staring out the viewport with a pensive expression. So, he said, breaking the silence, still think I'm just a guy who spends money on bad ideas? Lyra turned to him, her eyes glinting with something that might have been amusement. You're growing on me, Captain. Slowly. Elias chuckled, shaking his head. I'll take it. For the first time since they'd met, the tension between them eased, replaced by a tentative sense of camaraderie. But even as they shared a rare moment of quiet, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. You knew? He said after a long pause. I have a feeling this is just the beginning. Lyra's gaze lingered on him, her expression unreadable. You have no idea. With that, she turned back to the stars, and Elias couldn't help but wonder what he'd gotten himself into, and whether he'd survive long enough to find out. As the stars blurred into streaks around the Wayfarer, the hum of the warp drive filled the cockpit with a faint, steady rhythm. Elias leaned back in his seat, exhaustion settling over him like a heavy cloak. He stole a glance at Lyra, who was staring at the controls as if lost in thought. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "where do we go from here?" Lyra's gaze flicked to him, her expression guarded. "I thought you were the captain. Don't you have a grand plan?" Elias smirked. "Oh, absolutely. Step 1, don't die. Step 2, figure out step 3. For the first time, a genuine laugh escaped her, a soft melodic sound that caught him off guard. It was fleeting, but it warmed the cold distance she usually maintained. "Well, Captain Improvisation," she said, her tone lighter than before, "I suggest step 3 involves finding somewhere safe to regroup." Elias considered this, running a hand through his hair. Safe isn't exactly abundant in this galaxy, especially with a bounty on your head. Lyra's expression darkened, her shoulders tensing. The bounty's only part of the problem. If they catch me, it's not just my life at stake. They'll use me to finish what they started, to build more like me. Perfect weapons, obedient to their cause. Elias leaned forward, the gravity of her words sinking in. "You mean clones?" "Worse," Lyra said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They don't just copy genetics. They take memories, skills, even emotions. What I've fought to be, what I've learned to feel. They'd strip it away and replicate it." The cockpit fell silent, the weight of her confession settling between them. Elias finally spoke, his voice firm. "Then we make sure they don't get that chance." Lyra blinked, clearly taken aback by his resolve. "You don't even know me. Why would you risk your life for this?" Elias shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I've got a bad habit of helping people who don't ask for it. Besides, you've grown on me, slowly." The corner of her mouth twitched, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Careful, Captain. I might start thinking you're more than just a cargo hauler." "Oh, I'm full of surprises," Elias said, leaning back with a mock air of confidence. "Stick around and you'll see." Lyra shook her head, but there was a flicker of warmth in her expression. It was a fragile thing, like a flower blooming. In the middle of a storm, but it was there. A warning flashed across the screen. Proximity alert. Unidentified vessel approaching. Elias's hands flew to the controls, his easygoing demeanor replaced by sharp focus. "We've got company. Hold on." Lyra's expression hardened as she studied the readout. "It's not one of theirs, too small for a mercenary ship." "That's not exactly comforting," Elias muttered, adjusting their trajectory to put more distance between them and the approaching vessel. The ship's comm crackled to life and a voice, low and rough, filled the cockpit. "Wayfarer, you've got something aboard that belongs to us. Surrender now and we'll make this painless." Elias scoffed. "Painless, huh? Tempting offer, but I think I'll pass." "Wrong answer," the voice growled. The unidentified vessel fired, and the ship rocked violently as the blast grazed their shields. Lyra was already moving, pulling up tactical readouts and rerouting power. "Shields are holding," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "But they won't last if we keep taking hits like that." Elias gritted his teeth, maneuvering the ship into a tight roll to dodge another blast. "Suggestions?" Lyra's fingers flew across the console. "We can't outrun them, but we might be able to outsmart them. There's a nebula nearby, thick enough to scramble their sensors." "Perfect," Elias said, adjusting their course. "Nothing like flying blind to spice things up." The ship lurched as they dove into the nebula, the swirling clouds of gas and energy reducing visibility to near zero. The enemy fire ceased, but the tension in the cockpit only grew. Lyra's voice cut through the silence. "They'll try to flank us, stay unpredictable." Elias smirked despite himself. Unpredictable is my specialty. The ship weaved through the dense nebula, Elias's hands steady on the controls. Lyra monitored the sensors, her sharp eyes scanning for any sign of their pursuer. When the enemy ship appeared on their tail again, Lyra didn't hesitate. Divert power to the aft shields and prepare to cut engines on my mark. Elias glanced at her, a question in his eyes, but he didn't argue. This better be a good plan. It's a gamble, she admitted, her tone grim. But it's all we've got. At her signal, Elias cut the engines, the ship lurching as it came to an abrupt halt. The pursuing vessel shot past them, momentarily disoriented. "Now!" Lyra shouted. Elias fired the ship's forward cannons, the blasts, catching the enemy vessel squarely in its engines. The resulting explosion lit up the nebula, the shockwave rattling the wayfarer but leaving it intact. As the debris drifted into the swirling clouds, Elias let out a shaky breath. "You weren't kidding about the gamble." Lyra offered him a rare smile. "Sometimes risks pay off." Elias chuckled, his tension easing slightly. "Remind me to never play cards with you." The banter felt natural, a moment of levity amidst the chaos. But as the ship emerged from the nebula, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of their troubles. He glanced at Lyra, who was staring out at the stars, her expression unreadable. "So," he said, his voice softer, "now, what's step 4? Lyra didn't look at him, but her voice was steady when she replied. "We keep running, and we figure out how to end this, once and for all." Elias nodded, determination hardening in his chest. Whatever came, next they'd face it together. Elias adjusted the ship's course, his eyes scanning the navigation readouts. Lyra had retreated to the co-pilot's chair, her gaze fixed on the star-speckled void ahead. The tension between them had eased somewhat after their narrow escape, but the weight of unspoken words lingered in the air. "All right," Elias began, breaking the silence. "Step 4 is running. What's step 5? Lyra glanced at him, her expression softening just a fraction. "Step 5 is surviving long enough to figure out how to dismantle an empire." Elias raised an eyebrow, his mouth quirking into a half-smile. "You make it sound so easy." "Does sarcasm help you cope?" Lyra asked, her tone dry but not unkind. "Only way I know how." Elias shot back, earning the barest hint of a smirk from her. Before the conversation could continue, a sharp alert chimed from the console. Lyra leaned forward, her fingers dancing over the controls. "Incoming. Signal," she said, her voice suddenly tense. Elias frowned. "Another enemy?" Lyra shook her head. "No. It's a distress beacon." Elias hesitated, his instincts warring with his conscience. "Could be a trap," he pointed out. "Or it could be someone who actually needs help," Lyra countered. Her eyes met his, and for the first time he saw something raw and earnest. "There. You're the one with the hero complex, remember?" Elias sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine, let's check it out. But if it's pirates or bounty hunters, I'm holding you personally responsible." As the ship cruised through the dark expanse of space, Lyra adjusted her position in the co-pilot's seat. The tension between them was palpable. Despite the humor they'd shared earlier, there was an undeniable strain in the air. They were still in uncharted waters, both figuratively and literally. Lyra's fingers tapped the edge of her console as she glanced at Elias. "We can't keep running forever. Sooner or later we'll have to face them, whoever them are. The ones who want me dead, who want to use Talon to finish what they started." Elias nodded grimly. "I know, but we'll take it one step at a time. We've survived worse." She didn't answer, but the way her lips tightened said everything. Lyra was no stranger to the kind of stakes they were facing. Elias knew that. Look, it was the same one she'd worn back when they'd first met, when she'd been alone and fighting for survival. Now, they were fighting for something bigger, for the lives of people who didn't even know they were being hunted. The ship's sudden shake brought Elias out of his thoughts. He glanced at the console. An unknown ship was closing in. Too close for comfort. Lyra's voice was calm but urgent. "I don't recognize the ship. We're not dealing with just any bounty hunter. Prepare for another fight." Elias's hand flew to the controls, his eyes narrowing. This is getting old fast. He veered the Wayfarer into a steep dive, narrowly avoiding a blast from the pursuing ship. The ship lurched again as another shot landed on their shields, rattling the cockpit. Lyra's eyes were locked onto the enemy vessel, her mind already calculating their next move. "We're out of time. If we keep dodging like this, they'll wear us down. We need to hit back," Elias growled, frustration boiling up. Easier said than done when we're outgunned. He dove the Wayfarer toward a nearby asteroid field, weaving between massive rocks, hoping to throw off their attacker. "Any ideas?" Lyra's fingers danced over the console. "We have one shot at this. There's a broken relay station in the field. If we can get close enough, I can hack into their targeting systems, but we'll have to be fast." Elias's eyes flickered to her. "Let's do it." They raced toward the relay station, the enemy ship hot on their tail. Elias felt his heart hammer in his chest, the pressure building with every passing second. Lyra's voice cut through the tension. "Now!" Elias slammed the controls, sending the Wayfarer into a sharp turn toward the relay station. He watched as Lyra's fingers flew across the console, her eyes never leaving the screens. The enemy ship fired, the shot grazing their shields as they closed in on the station. "Almost there," Lyra muttered, her voice tight with concentration. Elias felt the sweat bead on his forehead as he continued to maneuver the ship. Every inch closer to the relay station felt like a gamble. And then, with a flash, Lyra's fingers tapped the final key. The enemy ship faltered, its targeting systems glitching as the relay station sent out a disorienting pulse. "Now!" Lyra shouted. Elias didn't need any more encouragement. He fired the ship's cannons, the blast hitting the enemy vessel squarely in its engines. The ship veered off course, spinning wildly before erupting into a fiery explosion. Elias let out a relieved breath, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. That was close. Lyra exhaled, her hand dropping from the console as the adrenaline wore off. Too close. As the debris of the destroyed ship drifted into space, Elias turned his attention back to the ship. "Are we good to go?" Lyra nodded, though her expression remained hard. "For now, but we can't keep running from our problems. Eventually we'll have to face them head on." Elias stared at the stars ahead, feeling the weight of her words. The battle wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. Lyra's expression hardened as she moved swiftly to Elias's side, her eyes narrowing at the faint blip on the sensor readout. She leaned over his shoulder, her fingers flying over the controls. "This is no coincidence," she muttered. "They know we're here." Elias's hand tightened around the throttle. "What the hell is that?" "I'm not sure," Lyra said, her voice tinged with frustration. "It's too faint to be a normal ship. It's probably cloaked, but they're coming closer." Elias glanced over at Talon, who had woken up, his eyes wide with confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice small but sharp. "We've got company," Elias answered, keeping his gaze focused on the sensor readout. "Stay low, kid. We might have to move fast." Talon's eyes darted between Elias and Lyra, his small hands gripping the edge of his seat. "Are they the bad people?" Lyra's lips pressed into a thin line as she exchanged a brief glance with Elias. "Yeah," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "But we're not going down without a fight." They followed the signal to a derelict freighter drifting in the shadow of a nearby asteroid field. Its hull was battered and scorched, and several compartments appeared to be venting atmosphere. Lyra scanned the ship. Life signs are faint, but present. Minimal power, no sign of hostiles, yet. Elias exhaled, gripping the controls tightly. "All right, let's make this quick. You stay here and monitor." "I'm coming with you," Lyra interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. Elias stared at her, debating whether to push back. Ultimately, he relented. "Fine, but stay close." The freighter's airlock groaned as it opened, revealing a dim, flickering corridor that reeked of burnt wiring and stale air. Elias and Lyra moved cautiously, their weapons drawn. "This place gives me bad vibes," Elias muttered. "You and me both," Lyra agreed, her eyes darting to every shadow. They followed the faint sound of labored breathing to a small, sealed compartment. Inside, a young boy no older than 10 huddled against the wall, his face pale and streaked with dirt. Elias holstered his weapon, crouching to the boy's level. "Hey kid, you all right?" The boy flinched at first but seemed to relax slightly when he saw Lyra. "Please help," he whispered hoarsely. Lyra knelt beside Elias, her voice gentle. "You're safe now. What happened here?" The boy hesitated before speaking, his words halting. "We were attacked. Everyone else gone." Elias exchanged a grim look with Lyra. "We need to get him back to the ship," he said quietly. As they helped the boy to his feet, a low rumble echoed through the freighter. Lyra's head snapped up. "That's not good." The ship shook violently, throwing them against the wall. Elias scrambled to his feet, gripping the boy tightly. "What the hell was that?" Lyra's expression was grim. "The ship's reactor is unstable. We're out of time." They sprinted back toward the airlock, the freighter shuddering and groaning around them. Explosions rippled through the corridors, sending sparks and debris raining down. Elias shielded the boy as they ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I knew this was a bad idea. Save the complaints for later," Lyra shouted, shoving him toward the airlock as another explosion rocked the freighter. They barely made it back to the Wayfarer before the freighter disintegrated in a fiery blaze. As the airlock sealed behind them, Elias collapsed against the wall, panting. "That," he said between breaths, "was entirely too close." Lyra didn't respond. She was focused on the boy who clung to her like a lifeline. Elias sighed, pushing himself to his feet. "Looks like we've got a new passenger." Lyra glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "We couldn't just leave him." "I know," Elias said softly. He ruffled the boy's hair, earning a faint smile. "Welcome aboard, kid." As they set course away from the wreckage, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that their decision to save the boy would have consequences they weren't prepared for. But for now, they had done the right thing. And that was enough. The stars outside the cockpit window blurred into streaks as the Wayfarer sped away from the wreckage of the freighter. Elias sat at the controls, his fingers tapping restlessly on the dashboard. Lyra was still watching Talon, her face a mask of concentration, but Elias could sense the weight of her thoughts. He couldn't help but wonder what she saw in the boy, what made her so fiercely protective of him. After a long silence, Lyra spoke, her voice almost wistful. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Elias glanced at her, surprised by the question. "You mean saving him?" She nodded, her eyes never leaving Talon. "I'm not sure. We don't know who he is, where he came from. What if it was a trap? What if he's not really just a survivor?" Elias turned his attention back to the controls. "You're asking the wrong person. I don't usually do things by the book. I'm more of a figure-it-out-as-we-go kind of guy." He shot her a sideways grin. "But I don't regret it. Not yet, anyway." Lyra met his gaze, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Good to know I'm not the only one who doesn't follow the rules." Talon shifted in his seat, his small form looking lost in the vastness of the cockpit. He looked up at them with wide, trusting eyes. "Are we going to fix it?" Lyra's eyes softened and she glanced at Elias before answering. "Fix what, Talon?" "The bad people," he said, his voice small but resolute. "The ones who hurt my family." Elias exchanged a look with Lyra. The boy had no idea just how deep the rabbit hole went. He didn't know about the empire they were. The tension in the cockpit thickened as the ship's engines hummed, the faint blip growing stronger. They were closing in, whatever it was. Elias didn't like the feeling. It felt too precise, too deliberate. "We can't outrun them," Lyra said suddenly, her fingers dancing across the console. "But I might be able to jam their cloaking device long enough for us to get a shot in." It'll be tight, but it's our best chance. Do it, Elias said, the words biting off sharper than he meant. We don't have time to waste. Lyra nodded, her face set in concentration as she activated the jammer. The entire ship vibrated as a pulse of energy shot out, disrupting the cloaking system just enough to reveal the shape of the enemy ship, larger than theirs, with angular, sleek lines that radiated an unmistakable menace. Elias's grip tightened. On the controls. I don't like the look of this, he muttered, his eyes scanning the ship's exterior. They're equipped for a fight. A warning light flashed on the console. Lyra's eyes widened. They're charging weapons. Before Elias could respond, the first blast hit the Wayfarer's shield, sending a jolt through the ship. Lyra cursed under her breath, her fingers flying across the controls, adjusting the shield strength. Hold on, Elias shouted as he veered the ship hard to the left, narrowly avoiding another barrage. The enemy ship was relentless, following them in tight pursuit. Elias needed to make a move, and fast. Anytime you want to take that shot, Lyra, Elias grunted, his eyes scanning the ship's layout. Lyra's hands were a blur of motion, her concentration absolute. Give me a second, she gritted out. Just need to get in range. We've got one shot at this. The seconds stretched into an eternity as the two ships danced through the void. Elias pushed the Wayfarer to its limits, but the enemy ship was gaining ground, its weapons charging for another round. Then, just as Elias thought they were done for, Lyra's voice rang out. Now! Without hesitation, Elias hit the trigger, sending a blast from the ship's cannon straight into the heart of the enemy vessel. The shot landed with a resounding explosion, sending sparks flying as the larger ship reeled, its shields flickering and failing. Lyra's fingers flicked across the console again, and another shot followed. This time it found its mark, a direct hit to the enemy's engine core. The ship buckled violently, and the unmistakable sound of a ship breaking apart filled the cockpit. Elias kept his hand on the throttle, pushing them forward, but he couldn't help the small grin that tugged at his lips. Direct hit, he said, his voice satisfied. That's how you do it. Lyra's hands were still at work, but she gave a faint, approving nod. Yeah, that was too close though. We can't afford to get cocky. The enemy ship spun out of control before finally exploding into a fiery display of sparks and debris. Elias let out a long breath, watching the wreckage burn away as the ship drifted farther into the void. We did it, Lyra said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. Elias took a moment to steady his breath, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. Yeah, he agreed, his voice softer now. But we're not out of the woods yet. Lyra turned to look at him, her face serious. We're running out of time. If they send more ships after us. She trailed off, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Elias nodded, glancing at Talon, who had curled back into his seat, clearly shaken but trying to put on a brave face. We'll get him to safety, whatever it takes. Lyra smiled faintly. That's the plan, but we need to be smarter. We need a safe place to regroup, find answers. Elias set the course for the next system, one that Lyra had mentioned earlier. A dead zone, quiet and hidden. But as the ship accelerated, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That this was just the beginning. The stars ahead seemed cold and distant, but the fear of what lay behind them felt even colder. The universe was vast, but the people after them were relentless. And the more they ran, the more questions seemed to pile up. Lyra turned to him, her gaze serious. We need to be prepared for whatever's coming next. We don't know who's pulling the strings, but they won't stop. Elias looked out at the expanse of space, his hand resting on the ship's controls. Yeah, well, he said with a half grin. We're good at making things explode. I think we've got this. Lyra smirked, the first real smile he'd seen from her in a while. Don't get too cocky, Elias. The last time you said that, we almost died. Hey, no one's perfect, he shot back, though there was a warmth in his tone. But we'll make it. Lyra gave him a look, then turned her attention back to the screens. Let's just hope your confidence holds up when we hit the next round. As the ship surged forward, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger. They had no idea what awaited them, but one thing was for sure: they wouldn't be running forever. The days that followed were a blur of constant vigilance, running, and brief moments of respite as they reached the quiet system Lyra had mentioned. The dead zone proved to be just as lifeless as its name suggested. No ships, no signals, just silence in the vast emptiness. It was exactly what they needed, a brief moment to recalibrate before the next wave of danger hit. But as they settled in, the weight of the situation slowly began to sink in. Elias couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted, constantly looking over his shoulder, his eyes darting to every shadow in the ship. He wasn't alone in this. Lyra, too, seemed restless, her gaze flickering nervously to the horizon every few minutes. Talon had mostly kept to himself since the attack, his face pale, his body tense. He was still the same boy they'd pulled from the wreckage, but there was a new weight in his eyes, a deeper understanding of the world, one no child should have. "We need to talk," Lyra said one evening, breaking the silence that had settled over the ship. Elias glanced up from the console, where he'd been trying to decrypt a set of intercepted communications. "About what?" She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "About Talon." Elias frowned, his fingers pausing mid-motion. "What